evening. Thanks for joining us tonight. A teenager facing criminal charges for a deadly high-speed crash will remain in adult court.
In court documents, the Brown County judge for the case believes moving it to juvenile court would diminish the seriousness of the crime, going on to call it inconsistent with the interests of justice and fairness. 16-year-old Sienna Pecor is facing 5 felonies, including first-degree reckless homicide for the death of a 17-year-old killed in that crash last year. Investigators say Pecor was 15 years old when she crashed her vehicle, going more than 100 miles per hour on West Mason Street in Green Bay. Brittany Schmidt looks at the reasons behind the decision in this First Alert update.
The 28-page court document from Brown County Judge John Zakowski outlines 3 factors he considered to keep 16-year-old Sienna Pecor's case in adult court. When it comes to a reverse waiver hearing, the burden of proof falls on the defense, which filed the motion to move the case to juvenile court. The judge held that 2-day hearing in July of this year. The defense argued Pecor would not receive adequate treatment in the criminal justice system if she remained in adult court. They argued the juvenile system has a higher likelihood of rehabilitating Pecor and lowering her risk of recidivism. The judge disagreed, saying there is no crystal ball to determine the success of Pecor no matter what treatment she gets, and he believes she can receive adequate treatment for her needs in the adult system. The defense also argued moving Pecor to juvenile court would not depreciate the seriousness of the offense. The judge disagreed, saying if Pecor is moved to juvenile court, she would only be held under the authority of the juvenile system for a total of 5 years. Judge Zakowski goes on to say Pecor's conduct and the possibility she could complete her supervision before the age of 21 is, quote, inconsistent with the interests of justice and fairness, end quote. In adult court, Pecor's first charge carries a maximum of 60 years in prison if convicted. A third factor Zakowski considered is whether it's necessary to keep Pecor's case in adult court to deter other juveniles from committing similar offenses. Zakowski doesn't believe young offenders pay attention to the courts and the consequences. The judge saying he would hope this case would cause a young person to think twice about driving fast on a busy city street, but he believes many incidents are due to impulsiveness. Judge Zakowski ultimately ruling that the defense did not meet their burden of proof in all the factors necessary to transfer the case to the juvenile system. He denied the motion. Pecor will remain in adult court. In Brown County, Brittany Schmidt, Action 2 News.